So we just completed Season 1 of Vinland Saga, and there's a lot on our mind. There's a lot of things that we're interested in talking about, and a lot of things that caught our attention. So the outline of this video is basically going to be broken into three subsections of the entire video, and that's the story, the characters, and our final thought. And getting on with the story, the main thing that really caught my attention about Vinland Saga was how long it took to kind of establish things. And I'm not saying that in a negative way, I'm just saying that because there were a lot of moving pieces in the story. And it wasn't like the events happen and then from there the story picks up. There were events that happened 20, 30 years ago that that had to be woven within the narrative with our main character Thorfinn and his father Thor's. Now, for me, when I initially saw the first 6, 7, 8 episodes, I was kind of wondering where this is going to go because I couldn't predict it. And that's, I think, one of the things that I liked about this show was that there wasn't that element of predictability. Like, I didn't know what was going to happen in the next episode, and that kind of caught my attention, or rather, it created interest for me with this show and made me stay on for as long as I did. And I think things didn't necessarily start to pop off until around episode 3 or 4 when Thorfinn's father, Thor, passes away. Passes away. And it's by an individual named Askeladd. And then from there, that's when things really started to change. That was basically the sort of, I guess, seismic wave in the narrative, if that's even the right terminology to use, that kind of switched up everything. And we see Thorfinn go from being this innocent, ambitious young kid to seeing something traumatic, and that is literally his father passing away right in front of his eyes, and him going on about what a true warrior is. And he gets this event, and it's so embossed in his brain that it literally, for 11 years, causes him to want to kill the person who killed his father, Askeladd. And we see Thorfinn go from being this ambitious, young, kind of innocent kid to being more ambitious, but also more dangerous, more interested in learning, and having such a high level of anger and resentment that's basically his motivation throughout the entire series, that he has this massive character development. And so, what do you think about that, Cloud?
Well, Tom, I think that the story surrounding Vinland Saga is ultimately about Thorfinn and Askeladd, mainly in relation to Thorfinn kind of growing up and going through this character arc that's very similar to those of other seinen type series, such as like Berserk or Vagabond or like Attack on Titan, where they have like a child or like a orphan type of character who goes through these traumatic events, and then it kind of spirals into this revenge-ridden plot and character archetype, where the character kind of starts out just like a regular child, and ultimately they kind of have this mindset who it is that they hate, and ultimately why it's just not a very good idea in the long run. With Thorfinn in particular, he has this vendetta against Askeladd due to him killing his father, and it kind of goes into how it kind of affects his life and how it kind of turns him from just like a young boy to like a very skilled but mentally troubled warrior. And ultimately it kind of all stems from Askeladd and how he chooses his way of life. And pretty much what it comes down to is Thorfinn taking orders from Askeladd and kind of having these little segments in time where he wants to vow like a duel to fight against Askeladd, and each and every time he always loses, mainly just due to him being an inexperienced warrior and just not very, very good at particular skills that Askeladd has. But Thorfinn does become a very skilled warrior. In fact, there are times in the show where fights against like these bigger, tougher men because Thorfinn in particular is very small compared to like the average sized men, and he holds himself pretty well and sometimes overcomes them in terms of not necessarily strength, but more so just like fighting abilities and strategic battles. Even though Thorfinn is a very hot-headed type character, and he is very just emotional and aggressive when he fights other people. Thorfinn, in particular, is a very very vengeful person, and he does have these tendencies to want to fight Askeladd, but can never win. But overall, I do think they do have some form of a relationship, because Thorfinn may hate the man for what he's done, and it might be something that's just deeply troubling to him in his mind. But I do think that overall, he does have some form of a affectionate relationship with him in terms of seeing him as like this, even if he doesn't fully obey, or even if he just really resents what he represents and what he's done. But what are your thoughts on these characters, Tom?
Yeah, great points that you bring up, Cloud. One of the main things that really made me love the show was the relationship between Askeladd and Thorfinn. Thorfinn doesn't necessarily have the most conventional childhood. I mean, lost his dad, basically hasn't seen his sister or his mom in 11 years, and he's basically the youngest person out of the group that he was with. He was a kid while all these other individuals were adults, and I guess they kind of accepted how life is, and Thorfinn was kind of going through this period of trying to make sense of the world, and in some ways Askeladd was kind of the only person who was around him. And you bring up a great point, how Askeladd and Thorfinn do have somewhat of a, maybe not an affectionate relationship, but there is that kind of bond that they share. It may not necessarily be as pronounced as the bond that he had with his dad, but it's somewhere there. And I think the scene that really reveals that is the ending scene in episode 24, when Canute kills Askeladd. Thorfinn is crying, he goes up to Askeladd, he is in tears, and then from there he goes up to Canute and slices him with his blade. And Canute basically says, that, I guess, is my punishment for what I took away from him. And I think 80% of the reason why Thorfinn was sad and mad wasn't necessarily because he cared for Askeladd, but because he was the one who wanted to get revenge for his father's death. But I think underneath all of that was probably a little bit of a bond that he had with Askeladd. And then from there, it's like, what is he going to do, right? Because 11 years he was so focused on his revenge for what Askeladd did to him personally and his family in many ways, that he wanted to, I guess, make amends with that. And another thing that I think is very interesting about Thorfinn is the fact that he has a lot of character development in this series. If we look at who he was from episode 1, if we were to get a screenshot of how he was in episode 1 and then show a screenshot of him from episode 24, and we didn't necessarily have context of what the episodes were going to be or what happened in between, I think most people would agree that, wow, that's a lot of development. There's clearly changes going on with him. And I think for him, a lot of that development was kind of through what Askeladd did. Now, Askeladd is a very cunning, smart, strategical individual. And I think a lot of that's revealed around episode 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, when he's doing all these sort of strategical setups and thinking about how he should kind of navigate through this crazy situation he's in with the king. And then towards the end of it, kind of goes on this emotional outbreak and ultimately kills the king. And then from there, obviously, Canute comes in and ends his life. But up until that point, he was just thinking so much with his mind and kind of being like a chess master in some cases in real life, or I guess in his sort of interpretation of real life, that from there he's navigating through these various difficult environments. And in many ways, this is kind of like training for Thorfinn to become a warrior. And even when Askeladd was basically dying, he told Thorfinn to go beyond more than what his father did. which I guess in some ways is kind of like encouraging to Thorfinn, or maybe that's not what he wants, right? So I would say that is kind of at least some of what I think about the story and the characters. Another thing that really stands out to me is just how much Askeladd was able to manipulate Thorfinn. I mean, he manipulated Thorfinn to do a lot of the duties that he would have had to done if Thorfinn wasn't there for him, such as going out patrolling people, such as fighting Thorkel, such as eavesdropping on adversaries from a different group. All of that was done because of Askeladd. Because of the vengeance that Thorfinn had against Askeladd, he was doing a lot of the dirty work for Askeladd. And because of that, Askeladd was able to do what he wanted. And at the end, Thorfinn didn't get the resolve that he wanted. So in some ways, even though Askeladd's dead, he won. I think a person could make the case that in some ways Askeladd did win long-term wise. But what do you think about the other characters?
I think that the other characters, the supporting characters throughout Vinland Saga, are pretty interesting, but I don't think that they're nearly as developed. And maybe that just comes with passing time in season 2. Thor's, I feel, is a very interesting character that sets up Thorfinn, but as a character on his own, I feel like he kind of has this sort of Lion King, Mufasa type of character arc. Not to say that they're the same, but I feel that they are very similar in the fact that they kind of represent this morally strong character who believes that violence isn't particularly the way, and that, there's things that you can do to things in society, and that you don't necessarily have to live within this barbaric sort of system. And I think that that morality that Thor's has definitely is something that sticks in the back of Thorfinn's mind. But with Thor's, I feel like since there was so little screen time with him, there just wasn't enough to really resonate with that character. I think that as a character, he's very fine, but I just think that a little bit more screen time with him might have impacted him more as a character. But ultimately, I don't think that Thor's is supposed to be the main character of Vinland Saga, because obviously it's about Thorfinn. But just a little bit more, I think writing might have made him a little bit more resident, not only with just Thorfinn, but I think like more with the audience. But ultimately, I think he serves his purpose just about fine, and I think that he pretty much, the story pretty much told what it needed to, especially with the scenes with Thorkill and Thor's when they're kind of younger, in their younger days, their younger mercenary days, and they're Thor's and his wife are just planning on like escaping. I think it was like Iceland, and Thorkill kind of has like this moment of like just not fully understanding why Thor's would leave the island when everyone thought he was dead. But Thor's pretty much told him just about everything that he didn't really like about how Vikings chose to live their life, and he wanted to build a farm and a family. Basically, just try to avoid any type of combat or very violent situations, so that he could build a sort of village and just have people live there peacefully, which Thorkill didn't take very lightly, which ended in them just having a little bit of a fight, and that they wouldn't have seen Thor's forever since. So I think that there's definitely a little bit of depth to Thor's, but overall I think he serves his purpose pretty much fine as a set-up character towards Thorfinn. But what other supporting characters do you find are very fascinating?
Yeah, great points, Cloud.
Tom.
Some of the side characters, I guess supporting characters that I really liked were Thorkel. I think he's a very fascinating, interesting character just because he's Thorkel the Great. He's the individual that no one can beat. He's dangerous. So many men were afraid of him just because of the damage that he could do. But it was interesting to kind of see his interaction with Askeladd and Thors and Thorfinn, Canute, even I think the king. There were some moments with him and the king, and he's just this kind of individual that just loves war. He loves fighting. He loves having a challenge. And I mean, he lost his eye, lost two of his fingers, and he he wasn't phased by that. He just kind of like, yeah, I'm ready to get into a battle again, and that was interesting. And he was kind of like a jolly character in some ways. So I like that a lot. There were other characters that I enjoyed too. Some of them I think like Leaf, especially. I think I said his name correctly. If I didn't, I apologize. But he was the character that was alongside Thorfinn when he was young, and then he went on this quest to try to find, I think, Thorfinn, because without Thors he wouldn't have survived. And when we see the moments that he has with Thorfinn at the end of season one, it is kind of sad in some ways because he just looked at him and saw, wow, this poor kid went through so much trauma. He went through so much. And then there's that image of Thorfinn before he got all this PTSD and trauma and suffering that was kind of inflicted upon him for no reason at all. And he's just this young, innocent child. And I remember when I was watching that, I was like, wow, that's sad. Those events changed him that much. And because of that, it completely led him down a different direction in life. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with him in the future, if he's able to turn that around, if he's able to not necessarily go down the path that Askeladd in many ways was kind of trying to make him go down, or the way that I kind of see Thorfinn is, does he head down the path that his father wanted him to go down, or does he head down the path that Askeladd unknowingly was trying to make him go down, with all the trauma, all the sort of mind games that Askeladd was playing on him. Whereas his father was like a real warrior, I believe, doesn't have a sword or doesn't need a sword, and his father was more so going down the path of nobility, right, taking taking a higher path in life, being above all of these things that he was formerly doing in his past life or certain periods of his life. So that'd be interesting to see. But I guess to kind of wrap this video up, what are some what are just a few pros that you have about season one, and what are a few cons that you have about season one?
Uh, so season one, I would say, is a very solid season. I think the Vinland Saga, what it excels at is it excels at doing a lot of setup, and then it has a lot of payoff. In terms of Askeladd, I feel like he was probably my favorite character out of pretty much everybody in the cast. Thorfinn being a second, but I think that overall Askeladd, he really steals the show. I wouldn't go as far as to say that he was the main character, but it feels in a lot of ways, when you really get down to it, I feel like that the show very, very heavily relies on him as like a very solid point in the show, where he kind of does a lot of these things that I don't think Thorfinn would necessarily want to do, but he does it anyways because he pretty much has to. And because of that, I think that Askeladd, with like his backstory and him being kind of like, this pillaging Viking, and just getting into all these wars and leading like this whole band of Vikings, if you will, this whole group of Vikings, and being, the main leader who kind of sets up all these certain events. It is very logical to think, at least in my opinion, that he is almost like a main character, and at least in like the season one events of things. Askeladd, not Askeladd, but Thorfinn, I feel is pretty much second, just due to the fact that he's very clearly the main protagonist, but because he's still so young and very inexperienced, or at least in comparison to like Askeladd, there's a lot of things that he just doesn't know about or isn't used to doing. And obviously following with Askeladd, he kind of goes through this experience, and ultimately that changes him for not necessarily the better, but it teaches him a lot of things that pretty much impact him for later. I would say that I feel like the pacing, at at least in terms of the anime, because I haven't read the manga for this particular series. But I feel like the pacing at times can be a bit slow. Not to say that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it does take a while for you to, at least for me, to really get invested in these characters. So while the setup is very much worth it and the payoff is very much also worth it, I think that the setup at times can be just a tad bit sluggish, and you really just have to pay attention to how these characters are kind of interacting, and where the story is going, and where that's really going with it in the long run. So that when it has like these big climactic moments, it really does get impactful, and it really does stick. But for some certain parts, it can be a little bit a tough time to really sit through. If there's another con I also have to point out, is that I just felt like the environments were a little bit samey. Not to say that the anime wasn't good and that it didn't have beautiful scenery at times, because Vinland Saga is pretty much well animated. Like I'm not sure if the first season was animated by Mappa or not. I don't believe so, but I think that it was. I think for the most part, it's pretty much a competent. It pretty much has like competent animation, but in terms of like the artistic background art, it could be a bit very desaturated, tedious on the mind, because of how desaturized everything is, and that the background art kind of feels very samey. Although I don't necessarily see this as a very big criticism, just mainly due to the fact that the story is mainly contextualized around Vikings and their setting in like 11th century Europe. So it's not necessarily that big of a deal. It's just it's something that I wish I could have seen a little bit more outside of maybe some mountains, or like in ice, maybe like in ice setting. And maybe the occasional wood setting. But overall, I do understand the artistic direction. It's just something I wish would have maybe been just a little bit more, just would have had like a little bit more flavor to it. But overall, I'd say that season one is a pretty good season, and I think it's solid from like start to end. And I would personally give it a 7 out of 10 if I would give it a proper rating.
Yeah, great points you bring up again, Cloud. Some of the pros that I really liked about season one was that there was a good mix of a few things, right? We had a little bit of humor, but mostly war. There was a lot of drama, a little bit of politics. Well, actually quite a lot of politics. And then from there, we kind of had connections between different parts of where the overall story is taking place with the characters. And so that was something that I liked. Another, I guess, pro that I had about season one was that even though Askeladd is dead, and I don't know if there's a supernatural element to the show where they could potentially bring him back, which I don't think that's the case. If we look at it just from his perspective and his motives and what he was doing as a character, I think that's a good wrap to his character, because we got to see him early on as being this kind of mysterious character, and it seems like he doesn't really have that much of depth to him. But then as things go on, we start to realize that there is a lot of depth to him, that he is smarter than he appears, that there's a lot more to him than meets the eyes. And then towards the end of the show, we get to see his backstory, what motivated him, how his father Olaf basically treated him horribly along with his wife, Askeladd's mom, and he was able to get revenge for that. And then he wanted to, I guess, change the world in some way, and throughout a course of 11 plus years, especially the years prior to that, because there were scenes where he was on the battlefield fighting Thorko, where he saw the first time that Thorko was able to kind of be somewhat weak. And so there obviously is more depth to him in his story that we don't necessarily get to see of in the anime. And so that obviously unfolds, and then from there, he was able to kill the king, and unfortunately he passes away. But in some ways, his story, I think, at least taking out all the characters and just focusing on him and his story, it's a good wrap up. And so I think that is kind of the main sort of plus for me in terms of season one. Now, some of the cons that I have with season one, as you mentioned, are the environments, the backdrops. I'm someone who likes a lot of kind of visual aesthetics, and Vinland Saga has great and amazing animation, but I wish there was a little bit more contrast with the background scenes. One of the things I really liked a lot in episode 1 or 2 was when they were talking about the land of Vinland, where it's this peaceful, prosperous part of the world that is just all green. The scenery that they were showing was all green, greeny and colorful, which I like. And then as the show started to progress on, it was more sort of snow based, and then there were kind of like these backdrops that were used commonly. And I remember one of the conversations you and I had off screen was that there was a moment where they pillaged this village, and this one lone survivor, this female lady, young lady, walks in, and then we see like these sort of northern light type of scenery. That's something I like. I wish they'd done more of that. They didn't have, they wouldn't probably have to have it in every episode, but if they did it frequently and had that kind of contrast, I think I would have like that a lot more. And then I guess another con that I have with the show is that the pacing was kind of slow. I know it kind of makes sense too, because they're setting up a lot of things, and this appears to be like it's going to be a story that's going to run on for a very long time. So it makes sense. They're laying down the groundwork to build upon for future episodes and future parts of the narrative to come. But I guess the pacing was a little bit better towards the end of the season. It becomes a lot better, and the pacing I like, and all the action starting to unfold. So that was something I liked. But besides that, in general, my overall view on Vinland Saga, that it's a great show. It's something I can see myself coming back to watching years from now. And it's something that I'm going to remain invested in, just because I want to see what happens to Thorfinn. I want to see if there's more information that we can get on Thor's or Askeladd or Thorkel, or what happens with Canute, what's going to happen to the world now since the king's dead. These are all things that are interesting me and on my mind, and that I want to obviously watch the new season of Vinland Saga to see what happens. So that's what I say about that show. And I'd give it, I'd give it like a 7.5, 7.6, 7.7 out of 10. And I guess that's my rating. But is there anything else you want to say before we wrap this video up, Cloud?
I just want to say thank you for having me on, Tom. And yeah, I'll definitely see season 2 of Vinland Saga, and I definitely remain pretty invested in this series. So yeah, it's definitely worth watching at least once. So I'd recommend it for everybody, even if it's not your cup of tea. I at least recommend you give it a watch, just to see if you have some sort of investment in it, and hopefully any in the future. So yeah, those would be my overall thoughts. Vinland Saga is a pretty good anime series. I would recommend.
Yeah, and thank you very much for your amazing views on this podcast episode, Cloud. And for those who liked our video, please leave a like and check out the channel and subscribe to it if you want to see more content like this. And also, please give us your thoughts down below on what you think about Vinland Saga. We'd be interested to know what your guys' thoughts are, and what insights you could give us that can, I guess, enhance our overall experience and interpretation of the show, or perception of the show. So, with all that being said, me and Cloud just want to say thank you guys for watching, and have a great day.